Thanks for joining us for the latest installment of the City and State Newsmakers series. I would like to thank Comptroller DiNapoli for sitting with us today. We look forward to an engaging conversation between him and our editor, Morgan. Their bios are in the program for reference. Before we get started, I just wanted to make mention of a couple housekeeping items. If you haven't seen this week's issue featuring Senator Gillibrand on the cover, please grab a copy. We're excited about the new aesthetic that our editorial and creative departments have worked diligently on achieving, and I'm highly recommending that you have a look. Secondly, you will find a copy of this morning's First Read daily email in front of you. If you are not receiving the First Read in your inbox, you should be, and that piece of paper will tell you how to sign up. With that said, it is my pleasure to thank our sponsors for this breakfast, ACCA Global, for their generous and ongoing support of City and States forums. And I would like to now introduce the head of ACCA's U.S. efforts, Warner Johnson, to tell you a little bit more about what they do and get the program started. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Warner Johnston, and I am the new USA CEO of ACCA. We are the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants. We are a global body for financial executives and accounting professionals, and one of the leading and largest such organizations around the globe. I joined ACCA last fall after serving 10 years of public service for both the state and city of New York. My last position was for Empire State Development, New York's lead economic development agency, and I've also had the privilege of serving in 10 years at the City Parks Department and was Deputy Press Secretary during the events of 9/11. ACCA approached me last year to serve as their head of US, and I could not be more pleased to work for this global organization. With a worldwide presence in over 170 countries, ACCA is the leading body of finance and accounting professionals with nearly 600,000 members and students. Some of the most important work that we engage in is ways to enhance and promote the finance profession. Partnering with credible organizations and securing prominent industry leaders is one way in which we serve our members in the countries in which we are located. As global thought leaders, ACCA focuses on many local and global issues that affect the economy, including sustainability, small business, and regulations, to name a few. We couldn't be happier in supporting this morning's forum with Comptroller DiNapoli. I've had the pleasure of speaking with the Comptroller in the past and have worked with members of his staff for years. Since first taking the position in February 2007, Comptroller DiNapoli has transformed the way his office does business, instilling reforms to make government more effective, efficient, and ethical. He has pushed for increased transparency and accountability in government and identified billions of dollars in waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the 54th Comptroller of the State of New York, Tom DiNapoli.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Warner. Mr. Comptroller, thank you. Yesterday, former Lieutenant Governor Richard Ravitch issued a report saying that even if the federal economy rebounds, that states like New York are still in real fiscal danger. And I was wondering if you felt like Dick Ravitch's analysis was accurate, and if so, what have you taken to address, what measures have you taken to address those dangers?
It's a timely question, Morgan, and I think Dick Ravitch, who in a short time as Lieutenant Governor really did an extraordinary job serving the people of New York. I was very pleased when he told me after he finished his tenure he was going to focus on the fiscal and budgetary challenges facing states. So his work, along with Paul Volcker, we should give Mr. Volcker some credit too, not just for Dick, really put together a very challenging and thoughtful analysis of the states. As you know, they looked at 6 of the larger states, and their analysis really points to the fact that we need to look at the budgetary challenges that we're facing, not as a temporary or cyclical challenge, but really as a fundamentally changed landscape for our states. And he pointed out several warning signs in terms of not only the obvious challenges of a very slow economic recovery and changed revenue stream, but the initial view that the uncertainty is going to continue for a period of time in terms of the federal relationship with the states. As we all know, there are automatic budget cutbacks that are scheduled to take effect in January of 2013. The lack of political consensus in Washington threatened, and really more than threatened, it derailed the effort to come up with a budget compromise to avoid some of those more onerous cuts. We need to see what will happen with the elections this year. The vulnerability there for New York, and we've pointed this out, is that January of 2013, while it's the beginning of the calendar year, for New York, it's actually the last quarter of our current budget. So although this budget we're hoping will stay in balance and certainly is a more responsible budget building on the progress of last year, that is a risk that's not been anticipated for in this year's budget. So bottom line, I think the Ravitch-Volker report points out that the fiscal stress and challenges we're facing are going to continue. The high cost areas are particularly related to health care, the need for states to better prepare for post-employment benefits, particularly retiree health insurance. States have not, by and large, put money aside to fund that liability and that obligation. Different than how we handle pensions, where we do set money aside and we have pension trusts that are set up. We could debate whether or not they're adequately funded or not, and that's an ongoing debate. But the Ravitch report pointed out that you're going to start to see a leveling off of the pension hit that we've had over the past few years. And the Ravitch report pointed out that New York is in the best shape. We were the only one of the states studied that had a fully funded state pension plan. So I think it reinforced some of what I've been trying to say, which is that by meeting our pension obligations, even though it's been painful over the past couple of years, it puts us in a stronger position. And the other kinds of points that they recommended also parallel what we've been trying to do in New York, more transparency in terms of how we handle our budget process. Do a better job of long-term planning, not just make budget decisions with a very short-term perspective, but try to, on a recurring basis, align spending and revenue. We still have our challenges there, but we made great progress. We've certainly pointed out the need to do that over a period of years. The governor and the legislature over the past 2 years have done a much better job of getting to that point. But we need to continue to stay focused on that as we slowly turn around our fiscal condition. We need to do a better job of building up our reserve funds so that we're better prepared for the kind of shocks that will probably continue to come periodically in the future. So I think the Ravitch report, in summary, is, I don't know if they told us things perhaps we didn't know already, but they quantified it and put real numbers there in a way that I think forces everyone to say we need to really look at what the future holds, the relationship between the federal government and the states, the implications then for local governments who depend on state support and federal support as well. And we need to do a better job of focusing on issues like health insurance for retirees. We've recommended over a period of years that the states set up an OPEB trust, which would in effect put money aside to pay for retiree health benefits over time. It's something New York City did a few years ago. But what we see in the face of the city's current budget problems, they've been drawing from that reserve, and that's how they've been dealing with their budget problems. So there are many issues out there that we're going to have to look at. The message is the states are going to continue to face great fiscal stress. We need to be realistic about what we are going to expect from state government, because the resources are just not going to be there to do everything we'd like.
You said that the state has been more responsible in its recent budgets, and yet it seems like one of the lessons that we learned from the fiscal crisis in New York City in the 70s is that we had to adapt GAAP accounting principles, and yet it seems like the state is still resistant to it, and that one of the things that the Ravitch-Volker report was pointing to was these budgetary gimmicks that we use routinely to balance the budget on a state level. Why is it that we cannot adopt these principles, and what is it just political resistance, or is there some sort of greater economic reason for it?
No, I think it's, I would reflect that it's more just the way business has been done in the state, and obviously there's more flexibility for state leaders without that. That being said, I think we have moved over the past 2 years to really depart from the past practices of doing the kinds of sweeps of various accounts that have built up money for certain dedicated purposes, and when money's there, money's swept out to be a one-shot revenue source, or pushing costs to the future. It doesn't mean we've totally eliminated some of those strategies, which would become more apparent if you had a GAAP accounting. But I think it's going to take a continued effort for us to continue on that kind of a path. I do think long-term it would make more sense for us to adopt GAAP accounting. When Dick Ravitch was Lieutenant Governor, that was part of his recommendations when he had a fiscal plan that he had suggested a couple of years ago, and that part of his plan I think did make sense. And perhaps as we get through this tough time, perhaps we can adopt that. So I don't think it's a front burner issue for folks. I think especially because the legislature and the governor have made progress, but long-term, that kind of structural change, I think, would make a positive difference. It certainly helped keep the city on the right path, no doubt about it.
It seems like so much of what happens in the financial stewardship of the state involves ways that you can kind of creatively circumvent rules. You know, that Robert Moses created the whole authority system so that money could be placed in ways that, you know, it could be used more creatively. And now we're seeing an explosion of IDAs and LDCs. And do we even have a handle on how many authorities there are now, how much money is in debt in the authorities, and is there an explosion of organizations or authorities that are kind of manipulating the system?
Yeah. Some people would like to blow up some of those authorities, so those kind of explosions perhaps are on the horizon. We have a better handle on them than we did before. We have an authority budget office now that tracks this information. We track some of it through our office. But I think the thrust of your question is very much on target. Over years, a period of years, we've set up these other structures to do good purposes by and large. But the reality is they operate without the same kind of transparency and accountability as a local government would or even a state agency would. And in that sense, they've really gotten out of hand in terms of their decision making and how they spend money. The total debt for the authorities is now, it's probably now, the budgets, if you add all the authorities, about 56 billion budget. So you consider the state budget's about 130 billion. You know, so that's a pretty big chunk of change that is being spent through the authorities, again, without the same kind of accountability that you have for regular state government. And the debt service there, that's what's been exploding. So you have, in effect, what we call backdoor borrowing. You know, New York State, for many years, and some of us are old enough to remember, periodically we would go to the polls and there'd be a proposition on the ballot for a borrowing. General obligation debt is now only about 6% of the debt burden of the state. So well over 90% of our debt burden comes from debt that's been incurred by the public authorities without voter approval, without the kind of scrutiny that you would have if you used general obligation debt. So I think we need to rein in that part of the work that the authorities do. Where we have seen a big increase in some of these structures, a little different than an authority, but the local development corporations, LDCs. Again, if they're set up with the right purpose and proper direction, they could be a positive tool in helping to promote economic growth, which is the big issue, right? Everybody's concerned about growing the economy. But again, we find too many situations across the state where LDCs have been used in a way that they've really been set up to avoid what's required under municipal law and state finance law, where taxpayers, in effect, are caught being responsible for some of the debt that's incurred for projects that the LDCs put forward. We do not have explicit authority to audit local development corporations. We've asked for that authority because, you know, sunlight is always the best disinfectant. It hasn't gotten through the legislature. We're going to keep pressing on that. With regard to the IDAs, also an important purpose to grow jobs and grow the economy. There hasn't been, I think, sufficient accountability there. Too many situations where IDA benefits are given out, not part of a thoughtful plan to create jobs. You have cases where a project was promising X number of jobs to be created, jobs weren't created, and yet there's no accountability. There's no clawback provision to get the benefits that were given back if in fact the jobs that were promised do not come into being. So I think public authorities generally, we need more accountability. IDAs, certainly more. LDCs, that's been our big focus, to say we need to do more to rein them in. And I think smarter management of debt with regard to authorities and having more of it to be handled in a more traditional way would make sense. And the whole area of authorities is one that we've gotten about 2 or 3 years ago increased power with regard to contract review. So we've actually ramped up our involvement with some of the larger contracts that authorities have been involved with. But even there, I would suggest that greater oversight and scrutiny of even more of the contracts that the authorities are involved with would make sense as well.
What other areas where would it make sense to expand the authority of your office? I mean, I know that you recently spoke out about some of the powers being taken away from your office and being centralized in the executive branch, and it seemed like that was a way of kind of sidestepping the review and the audit of certain contracts. And one insider who I had spoken with said that that was an area of great concern, and that he predicted that the next city time would be in that area, because it would be so easy to sidestep the rules. And so it seems like power is being taken away from your office when perhaps you need to have more power invested in your office so that you can properly monitor the state's finances.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we're not looking to grab power. I mean, that's not what this is about. And I think in terms of an area of expanded role for our office, more with regard to public authorities would be the area I would point to. So an expansion of what the legislature has already given us in terms of a limited review of authority contracts to make that more inclusive of authority contracts, which we would use our discretion in terms of which ones to really drill down on. But I think the latter part of your question is the one I have greatest concern on now. My concern is this: will the successful effort this year to take away some of our ability to review contracts be expanded next year? This involved, some of it's, I guess, somewhat inside ball. It wasn't exactly front page news, but as part of streamlining government, making it smarter, something I think we all would agree makes sense, the governor proposed for what are called centralized contracts through OGS for what has been the established Comptroller's Office review of those contracts, for that to be taken away. We still have our audit authority after the fact. The concern that we had with that proposal was that if there's a contract that doesn't have the best value for taxpayers, if there's a contract being proposed with a vendor that has vendor responsibility issues, outstanding labor issues, perhaps criminal concerns based on past involvements. Those are the kinds of issues that when we have contract review, if we see a problem, we can say, no, the contract can't be approved that way. And we work with agencies to get the contract in the shape where it can be approved. Sometimes it's an outright disapproval and they have to go to Plan B. But very often, when we raise objections, we work with the agency to get to a good result. The argument was, well, your review slows down the process. And by statute, we have 90 days to review contracts. Contracts that are reviewed in our office, for the vast majority, are completed within 2 weeks, and many within a matter of days. So I think the argument that the Comptroller's review was slowing down the process really was not based on the track record and the numbers. And the concern we have is these centralized contracts could end up being very large contracts. It could be worth billions of dollars. So if a mistake is made there, it could be very, very costly. And I think the parallel to city time, is probably not inaccurate. I'm not predicting it, but it could very well happen. We know that's been the history with other large contracts. So from my point of view, at a time where we're all concerned about accountability, looking out for the taxpayer dollar, to take away what has been a positive role of that extra set of eyes and ears, listening and reviewing, and looking at what's being presented, to take that away made no sense. Better that we stop a bad contract from happening rather than let it happen and then after the fact come up with an audit, a year later that says it could have been a better deal if it had been done differently. There's really, in many cases, no recourse after the fact when you do an audit. So my concern moving forward is that not be a precedent for taking away more of the independent review. The Comptroller's office is it's a wonderful office, but it's not the easiest office to explain to people what we do. ACCA members know what we do, right? You can relate to our financial role, right, Warner? You know how important it is, and we love accountants, and they usually love us. But to the general public, because our mandate is so broad, and we look at so many facets of the workings of government, we don't necessarily stand out in a clear way in terms of the work that we do. The office was created in 1797. It's been out a long time. And in other states, the responsibilities we have are divided up into different offices. So you may have a state treasurer or a state auditor. If someone was elected state auditor, you kind of know what they're doing, right? In New York, we've really put together under one office the role of comptroller, treasurer, auditor, trustee for the pension fund. It's all in one office. And that's wonderful in terms of the Comptroller's office and the great work that we do, but it's difficult to sometimes communicate to the larger constituency out there the importance of the work that we do, because it may not stand out. So I'm hoping that the words that we've offered of caution about this kind of a direction will be listened to. The office was set up to really keep an eye on what was going on. It was an appointed office from the beginning, and every time the Comptroller would point out, how spending was not being handled properly or a scandal based on legislative or gubernatorial action, the Comptrollers were always unappointed. So they put someone new in so they wouldn't make noise. And things got so bad in the 1840s, there was a really big scandal, and they were forcing out the Comptroller again. There actually was a public outcry, and they changed the office to be an elected office. It was originally an appointed office, and it became elected to be an independent voice. People sometimes ask me, what is it like, working in state government and, reporting to the governor? And I have to, well, we don't report to the governor. We report to the people. We're an independent voice. We're put there to keep an eye on how money's being spent. What is the legislature appropriating? What is the governor approving? What contracts are being let? Is the money being spent in the right way? Not to make a policy judgment on where the money's going, but is it being spent in the right way? That's why we're there. So anytime you take away the ability for that independent review, I think you're really undermining the purpose and intent of having an independently elected auditor. I'll use that word because I think it's more descriptive of what we do in terms of contracts and payments and post-audit responsibility. And that really takes away one of the fundamentals of the checks and balances that this office is supposed to be very protective of.
You talked about the history of how the Comptroller's office became an elected position, and many of the people in this room are financial professionals or accounting professionals, and yet that's not your professional background. You had a long, distinguished career in the legislature, but I've heard it said that given the immensity of the responsibilities of the Comptroller's office and how absolutely complex our financial world has become, that perhaps it makes sense to go back to a system where the Comptroller is appointed rather than elected, because that way we could ensure that it was a person who had, the financial background as opposed to just one as an elected official. Yeah. I was wondering what you think about that.
Well, I think the key to the office is the independence, and I do think in our system it makes sense to have high offices to be elected, because the accountability then is back to the public. And again, because in New York, the Comptroller's office does so many different responsibilities, the key, I think the key to the office is the leadership you bring and the vision you bring on all the working parts of the office. And, you look at the tradition of the office, and you look at, my predecessors in recent years, and I think it's probably true for predecessors going back over many years, they are people who are involved with public service, people who have run for other offices, Alan Hevesy was a assembly member and then a city controller before he was controller. Carl McCall was a state senator. He worked for a time at Citibank, but his pedigree was really community service, elective office. Ned Regan was a county executive in Erie County. Arthur Levitt, who really set the standard for this office in the post-war era, he was a lawyer and head of the Brooklyn Board of Education, the City Board of Education, I guess at the time. He came from Brooklyn, City Board of Education. So you look at the people who have been in these offices, and they have been people steeped in public service who have been smart about hiring the kind of professionals who have expertise, whether it's in the financial end, the accounting end, the auditing end, pension fund management, contract review. The controller, I always think it was a mistake. One of the other, points has come up in the past, and at the time I was first going through the selection process for controller, I didn't have Wall Street experience, And especially with the New York State Controller position, because it is the sole fiduciary, there is this misunderstanding that the controller is the person that sits there with the Wall Street Journal every morning and looks at the stocks and tells everybody how to buy and sell, and that is such a misunderstanding of the role of this office in terms of investments. We hire a professional staff to do that work. We have advisory committees that guide us. We have professional consultants that guide us. What you want, though, is someone in this position that understands the importance of the bigger picture, of moving the office forward, is sensitive to the public accountability, concerned about transparency and accountability, and making sure that, whether it's on the auditing side, the accounting side, the pension fund investments, that the team of people hired, the professionals who have the expertise in all these areas, because you can never find one person an expert in all those areas to be controller anyway. There's just too much variety in the office. That they are following the procedures of the office, that they are doing their job with a sense of ethics and responsibility. And that, to me, is always going to be better in the hands of someone who understands what public service is about, what elective office is about, what accountability back to the public is about. And I think if you take that away, either by election or appointment, and just give it to a specialist in one of those areas, I think it's going to not be the best outcome in terms of the overall management of the controller's office. And I certainly think an appointed position, you'd lose the independence, and that's really, I think, the key point of this office. It's the key credential is someone who is going to be independent. And once you're appointed, you're going to go back to the way it was, in the 1800s, where, someone's going to be gun shy about being critical of an administration or a legislature. They're not going to want to lose their job. And if you always have to report back to the public, that gives you, I think a bit of strength. I should also point out, this may not help the argument for an elected controller, but the first elected controller in New York State was Millard Fillmore. He was a good controller. Might not have the greatest reputation
Are you going
as
to make
a
news
president.
today? You're
No,
running for
make no news. But you know how he got it? He was a Whig, and I'm not changing parties to the Whig Party. I'm staying as a Democrat. And the Whigs were looking for a vice presidential candidate. So he got nominated to be vice president on the ticket with Zachary Taylor. And then Taylor ate those cherries or whatever he did, and then he died, and Fillmore became president because of the death of the president. So he went from state controller to vice president to president. And no, we're not making any news, even though I gather there's a vacancy on the other party that they're looking to fill.
Well, you talked about some of your predecessors, and your immediate predecessor is in prison right now, right? And then his predecessor, Carl McCall, was also involved in he was a placement agent, right? Involved in some of the unpleasantness in your office. And so, since you're charged with minding the shop, what have been the safeguards? Warner alluded to it a bit, but what have been the safeguards that you've put in place to make sure that the person at the helm of the controller's office is doing a just and honest job?
Yeah, it's a very diplomatic question.
Thank you.
But it is, it's a sobering notion, right? Especially when you're in a public office, an important public office, and you have a great deal of pride about that. but you reflect that the person who was there before you is sitting in a prison cell at the moment. So I think it's a pretty stark reminder, about how fragile notions of trust and reputation are, and how important it is to safeguard that. And certainly with regard to the issue of pension fund management, we know that there were some real problems here. Arguably some of what led to that had to do with ways of doing business that existed not just in New York, but for a long period of time, particularly with the role of placement agents. And in the case of what happened in New York, not to damn everybody who's worked as a placement agent, what happened was that role, which when handled correctly and with honor, is the way of doing business in most states still. It's not really been changed too much, as I understand it, in most states. It was really corrupted, where in effect you had, particularly in the case of Hank Morris, an individual who had a special relationship with the office and was able to, in ways that were not apparent at all, which is how they were able to get away with it so long, reaping millions of dollars in placement agent fees, really calling into question the integrity of the entire investment evaluation process. The challenge for me when I first came in, of course, was that we didn't know this. Nobody really knew it. The investigation was really just starting back in 2007. What we tried to do in the beginning when we first started to realize there was a problem, again with the notion that transparency and openness is the first prerequisite to good government, we had a disclosure process in place. Any investment transaction that involved a placement agent would have to have that identified before the transaction was closed. We'd publicly report it. And that level of transparency, I had hoped would give us the ability to make sure if there was any pattern of abuse, we'd become clear and we'd be able to stop it. What also became clear as the results of the investigation started to come out is that what had happened under the Hevesy administration was such a perversion of that placement agent role that the only way really, from my point of view, to guarantee that we would not have that kind of compromise happen again would be to go further than just simply disclosing. Because if you're disclosing and then you find out after a period of months or years that something's been amiss, what's the value of it? I took the position instead that we needed to ban any transaction involving a placement agent. That way we wouldn't have to worry about disclosure because it wouldn't be happening, and we wouldn't find out after the fact that somebody had a compromised relationship. I believe there may be one other state that's moved in this direction. Some other states have moved towards the disclosure strategy that we had first implemented. But we put the ban in back in, I think it was probably around 2009 that we formalized it. And some in the industry said we're going to lose opportunities by doing that, and especially for newer investment firms, women and minority firms who often need placement agents to help with the access to institutional investors, that we were going to be hurting that part of the business. But our experience has been positive. We're big. People know where to find us. We have very aggressive emerging manager programs that are geared to providing opportunities for women and minority firms. So I think that compensates for not having the placement agent role. So I think the biggest change that we've made from a specific different way of doing business is eliminating that placement agent role. This way I have no concern. There's no middle person involved. There's not going to be that kind of compromise. And we've certainly tried very hard through a broader notion of what ethical behavior is about, what integrity is about, ethics training, a special counsel for ethics, very focused on what the investment professionals are doing. We've set the right tone at the top, that we have restored the reputation of the investment part of the office, but that is something we need to guard, safeguard, and protect, and we cannot tolerate any kind of behavior or even a whiff of compromise that would really destroy what we've worked so hard to rebuild. So I think we've made a huge change there, and I give credit to the men and women who work in our investment division. But I think the biggest structural change that we made that's made great sense was eliminating the placement agent period. New York City does that as well, but as I said, most states it's still allowed. We had asked the SEC to do a ban nationwide. They chose not to do that, but I've indicated during my tenure we're not going to change that. We're going to keep that position. So I think that's probably the single most important step that we took to take away what had really been the source of a horrible problem of corruption in our office.
And as much as you've done to combat abuse and poor practices in your office, you also have to monitor all of the companies that you invest the billions of dollars in the pension funds with, right? And we've seen so many cases about funny accounting and problems in some of the largest Fortune 500 companies. What are you doing to minimize risk with the investment of the pension fund, and what are the trends that you're watching in your office in terms of investments?
Well, we're looking at many different areas of concern with regard to corporate behavior. As you point out, we're large. We have billions of dollars that we're investing. A lot of our money in public equities happens to be in index funds, so we're a passive investor. You set up the index, you have the profile, and our perspective is we're a pension fund. We have a perpetual investment horizon. We're going to be around forever. So we are buy and hold investors. We're in it for the long term. So our goal is to make sure that the investments we have, that we're minimizing risk, as you point out, and that if we're invested in a company where there may be a problem, our goal is to get that company to change its corporate behavior so that we can continue to stay invested with them and we can continue to make money. Sometimes when we're invested in a company that may be called on doing something wrong, whether it's some of the banks and some of the issues they've had, or a company that may have a poor environmental record or a poor worker safety record, people say, pull your money out. If you pull your money out, that's going to force them to change their behavior. I think the experience is, even though we are large, we're a $150 billion fund, even though we are large and we have significant holdings, in and of ourselves, and even if several pension funds were to do that, there's always going to be someone else to buy those shares. So I think that notion of picking up your chips and going somewhere else really doesn't make a lot of sense, and you lose your leverage. So we've chosen to take the position, with the exception of investments related to Sudan and Iran. We've taken the position that we're going to stay invested in companies but get them to change their behavior. So we've ramped up our corporate governance involvement. We have staff that's dedicated to looking at the issues that are there, looking at the profile of the companies we're invested in, and our engagement takes many different forms. We will write a letter asking for a change in policy or procedure at a company. We will start a dialogue. In some cases, especially if we're not happy with the initial outreach, we'll file a shareholder resolution. And sometimes that will prompt an agreement or a compromise. Sometimes you take it to a vote. Sometimes you win the vote, sometimes you lose the vote, but you keep pressing until you get the outcome. In some cases, we've sued, where we had losses. After BP had the Gulf oil spill, we had significant losses. We're co-lead plaintiff in the class action suit against BP. So the issues we're looking at, we always look at governance issues. We had a big engagement this year with Chesapeake Energy, real concerns about the financial management, the lack of oversight of how the CEO was managing the affairs there. We look at issues of executive compensation. Is executive compensation excessive? Is it tied to the goals of success for the company? We've joined on with a coalition of other institutional investors to look at the issue of board membership, and particularly the severe underrepresentation of women on our corporate boards, and we're involved with pressing companies in that area. We've been very engaged with a host of environmental issues. Climate change has been an area of focus we've had great concern on. We had a very effective lead involvement with Massey Energy. That was that coal mining company where you had that terrible disaster. 24 miners were killed, and very arrogant corporate leadership, and we were very involved with forcing a change there. That resulted in not only the CEO resigning, but the company straightening out its act and its corporate leadership, and then being bought by another company at a very elevated stock price. So the Massey was really a case of pressing a company on climate risk issues and on worker safety issues, and recognizing that the risks that they were exposing our stock holdings to because of poor performance in those areas really was a window into the fact that they were not well managed in a whole host of other areas, including financial areas. And by getting a corporate change there, the value of the company went up. They became very attractive to be bought out by somebody else, and we made money on it. So doing good things from a corporate perspective actually meant doing well for our investment. So sum it up, we have a broad agenda in terms of our corporate engagements. We pick and choose where we do our shareholder resolutions or we do a specific engagement, but we have a very active roster. We work with other organizations, Council on Institutional Investors and others, and I think this has been an area where we've built on some good progress that some of my predecessors were involved in, but I think we've taken it to a new level in recent years, and I'm very proud of the work that our staff has done in that area.
We're going to go to questions from the audience in a moment. I just want to ask you one final question. Another part of your job is the oversight of local municipalities. And we've seen a lot of counties like your county, Nassau County, so troubled despite the fact that it's one of the wealthiest counties in the country. Syracuse, Rockland County, all across the state, we seem to have cities and counties in great financial turmoil. And I was wondering what you thought that needed to be done to make sure that that we're managing our finances more responsibly on a municipal level.
Yeah, and I think this is also part of the the implications of the Ravitch-Volker report, is that the other trends happening at the national and state level are going to exacerbate what's been a problem at the local level. Municipalities are facing, they're being impacted by what we're all being impacted from the slow economy, tax base erosion, not getting as much support from the state or the federal government, increasing costs that are required, health care, pensions, and others. And in some cases, a history of making some poor choices that have come home to roost. Certainly, in terms of my home county, I think that's very much part of the picture there. We've had different approaches. Wow, that cough really echoed in there. Woke everybody up for the question part. We've tried different strategies. In the case of Nassau County, we actually have an oversight board, and we've had that in Erie County. City of Yonkers has had it. The question is, if you have more and more municipalities ending up in this condition, are we going to have these kind of boards everywhere? It's a question we have to look at. I think what we want to do is heighten our oversight to develop a better early warning system of those municipalities that will really be in trouble, and then try to suggest some remedies. But one size is not going to fit all. Every dynamic is a little different, so it's going to be a challenge for us to navigate that.
I mean, should we look, or should we be wary in the future of bankruptcies, of bailouts for counties and cities? I mean, is that where the trends are leading?
Well, there's no money for the bailouts, is one problem. You mentioned Nassau County. When we first had our challenges about 10 years ago, and it was, just as it is now, one of the wealthiest counties in America. And again, much of it, I think, had to do with poor choices at the local level. The oversight board was put in place, and the debt was refinanced. And I remember, because I was a legislator from the county at the time, and had argued for not only setting up the oversight board, but for aid, in effect, a bailout to help the county level its finances. And I remember colleagues, even I know Councilman Mark Weprin was here. Is he still here? Where is he? Yeah, there he is. He's back there. He's looking at his BlackBerry. But guys like Mark Weprin, from the city said, wait a minute, Nassau County's got more money than anybody. How come we have to give them $100 million? I'm not sure you said that exactly, but you were probably thinking it at the time. And we did it with the promise that by having the Oversight Board, by having the refinancing of debt, and by having that $100 million, the county would get back on its feet. And here we are 10 years later, and they're in the same, if not worse, situation.
Right.
The state cannot bail them out. They already have an Oversight Board, and they're fighting with the Oversight Board most of the time. You know, so I don't think that leads to the next question, part of your question, which is bankruptcy. I don't think that's going to happen. But it does lead to a lot of turmoil, a lot of tough choices about spending at the local level, and a lot of confrontation at the local level in terms of priorities and making budget decisions.
Just when you were saying about these oversight boards, I mean, aren't we saying effectively that our elected officials haven't been up to the task of managing these municipalities? And that kind of brings me back to the question about whether the Comptroller's office should be an elected office, because it seems like if we're saying we need to impose these oversight boards because these are the people who actually know what they're doing and the elected officials don't, it makes me wonder if the Comptroller's office, whether that same type of reasoning could be applied to the Comptroller's office.
Well, you could probably make that judgment.
I'm sure
a
that's
lot
not
of a lot of
the one that
elective
you would wanna
offices
make.
too, though. Well, we're not going back to a monarchy,
Yeah.
so no, I think by and large elected is better than appointed. And keep in mind, whenever there is an oversight board, it's by an act of the legislature, and usually at the request of the local government involved. So
Yes, questions from the audience?
part of
Assistant Comptroller. I just had a question about campaign finance. I know that you were a big proponent of it, introduced a bill. Just wanted to hear your thoughts about why you think it's important that public financing of elections is actually made for the office of the state comptroller, and where you think it's headed in the state. Thank you.
I think it's such an important question. The question was on campaign finance reform. It's obviously a hot topic. A lot of folks are talking about it. I'm hoping that talking about it means it's about to happen, although it's been talked about before and it hasn't happened. You know, getting back to some of Morgan's earlier questions, part of what happened with the problems in the office during the prior administration, much of it had to do with money going to individuals in their pockets, but some of it had to do with campaign contributions as well. So I do think that for this office, partially because of the pension fund work, but also because it is that office that's supposed to be independent, supposed to be above the partisan fray, the objective, independent office to look at spending, not in a partisan way, but in a way that's good for the people of the state. I think this is the office that is the least political in that sense, and particularly would lend itself to being an office that you'll want independent people and people who, because of the inherent challenge of not being compromised by campaign contributions, that this is a great place to start by saying we're going to have campaign finance for the Comptroller's office. We've put forward a bill for 5 years now, 6 years now, that would basically build on the model of New York City with matching funds. We've changed it from our first proposal, and now we really do have, you know, a low dollar threshold in terms of contributions that could be matched, limits on how much money could be spent on the campaign. I think especially for this office, because unlike the other offices, we have now, because of the SEC, and we had done this voluntarily in New York and asked the SEC to do it as a permanent policy. It's a good thing. There are severe limitations on who can give to our office. So in very broad stroke, people involved with financial services, if they want to have any prospect of doing business with our fund, as large as we are, they can't give. So many of the folks who in the past would have given to this office can't anymore. So the ability to raise money for the Comptroller's office is very limited. It's supposed to be the most independent office. I really think unless you want to limit the office to people who are going to be able to self-fund, you know, I think one of the big issues about campaign finance reform and public financing that we don't focus on enough is the issue of access in terms of who can put themselves forward to run for office. I really worry about the future, you know, in terms of who could compete for Comptroller down the road. You know, that being said, I do think campaign finance reform for all public offices in the state and public financing for legislative as well as statewide offices should happen. I think, again, in terms of leveling the playing field of competition and taking away even the appearance that large donations is going to compromise the decision making. I think that's essential if we're going to restore, some sense of confidence in the system. Do I think it's going to happen overnight? I wish it would. I don't think so. Part of it is the cost question. And that's why I do think if we start with this office, prove that it can work, and we actually had some suggestions on ways to fund it beyond a checkoff and money from the general fund, which is of concern when the general fund doesn't have a lot of money. I think this would be a good office to start with in 2014 and then move to expand it to the other offices. But I think we need to give people a sense of access again and a sense of trust again. And a public finance system may not be perfect, but it's got to be better than the kind of money that's flowing right now. And you overlay that with the impact now of these super PACs and the Citizens United decision. I didn't mention that in the corporate governance. We've also been very involved with getting agreements and filing resolutions to get disclosure on political spending of corporations. This is just ramping up, the power of private money in the political system. None of that in the long term is good.
Well, I mean, you spent a long time surveying in the legislature, so you understand how it works. And we just saw with independent redistricting that when it comes to the self-interest of legislators, that is the most intractable area for the legislature to act. And that makes me think that it's highly improbable that the legislature would, put into effect a system of campaign finance that would be working directly against the self-interest of the members. So I'm wondering how that hurdle can be overcome legislatively.
Well, I do think there's a growing public sentiment for this, and I do think that with all the corporate money that's being thrown around right now, that's raising people's awareness and sensitivity. So I do think that do I think that people will vote for or against a candidate solely on that issue? Probably not, as opposed to some other issues. But I do think it's in the public discourse a whole lot more. And certainly you've seen the governor indicate that he wants to make it a priority. So I'm going to take the point of view that the better angels will be listened to, and that we will get something. I just hope it's broad enough, and I hope it's not just put off till 2018. If it feels like it's far enough away, you won't have to worry about it. I really think there needs to be some changes. There's just too much money that's allowed to be spent, too much private money. And again, it's not just a question of capping the amount of money. We need to provide the venue for more citizens to be engaged in the system. And that means not only capping the amount of money of contributions, but you got to do the other end. You have to provide the matching system to encourage good people to not sit on the sidelines, but in fact to come and run. Look, you may be right. It may be a little further off for some races, but again, given the history of this office and my personal interest in it, that's why I said let's start with this office, and I think it would be a good model for us to build on for other changes down the road.
Mr. Comptroller, much has been made about the strain on the state budget because of public pensions and health care costs. But very little is ever spoken about the drain that these authorities that have very little oversight and how they've grown in the last 10 years has a drain for the future on debt. Can you talk a little bit about that on the state?
No, the biggest area of debt growth is exactly that area, and there really hasn't been an adequate accountability for how that money is being spent. Debt service is one of the fastest growing parts of the state budget, and ultimately with the public authorities there is an impact, whether it's directly as far as taxes or if it's on fees, or in the case of the MTA on tolls and fares, or in the case of the Thruway Authority, which you're going to be hearing more and more about. They're talking about raising the Thruway tolls again. We have this little public works project called the Tappan Zee Bridge that's being talked about that obviously has to be paid for somehow, and it'll probably be largely through an authority. There are tremendous implications. So I think your question is right. I mean, look, let's face it. Part of why the authorities were set up years ago was that they would not be in the same area of public discourse as other areas of government spending. So if you go to your senator or your assembly member and you say, how come my subway fares are going up so high? Well, I wish I could do something about it, but that's the MTA. It's not really us. And we're probably not going to change that, but we need to recognize that. I think the implication in your question, Ernie, is the right one. That very often, and I'm very sensitive on the pension issues for obvious reasons, we've picked on that area to the exclusion of other areas that have also been going up significantly. And I do think, as I project, just dealing with that pension question, that we've never fully gotten enough folks to understand that we had an historic market loss in 2008 and 2009. We are still working our way through that loss, but we are working our way through it. We've had 3 years now of positive return. We are back up to about 150 billion, give or take, changes obviously, but our last end of year number, which is the number we use for our calculation, was at 150.3 billion. At the peak before the meltdown, we were at 155 billion. So we're back in the 150 range. We paid out benefits last year of 8.5 billion. So we've been paying out benefits, and we're growing the fund again. And we take 5 years in our calculations to work through a market loss like we had in 08 and 09. So we got 2 more years to go where there's going to be upward pressure on the rates. But unless the world is going to collapse all over again, which I guess is possible, but I'd like to think is not probable, you're going to start to see the rates not only stabilize, but start to go down again. The same, I don't think, could be said about the trend that we're seeing with authority, debt, and some of the other areas. So, and I do think, on the pension question, at a time that people are concerned about our economy and people having confidence to spend money, we also need to keep in mind that for the New York State plan, I don't think it's too different for the New York City plans either, close to 80% of our retirees, after they retire, they live in New York State. They don't move to Florida or Carolina or somewhere. They stay right here. So that means of that $8.5 billion we pay out in benefits, about $6.5 billion is money that continues to be spent right here in our state. That's money that's paying taxes, it's spending money in the local stores, it's giving people the kind of security that they can maintain themselves in their retirement. And that's money that's recycled back into our economy. And other organizations have done analysis of the multiplier effect of retirees with a secure retirement income and what their spending does in terms of job creation and economic. So we need to also look at the pension question, not just from the point of view of what the cost is, but there are benefits to it as well. And I do think as a country, we are entering an era where many folks of my generation are not going to be prepared for retirement. And there are tremendous implications during the people having to work way beyond when they should be working, which also creates a problem as far as job opportunity for the young people coming up. Or people not being able to, as we live longer and longer, to provide for themselves at a time where family structures are very different than they were years ago. And ultimately, if we don't provide people with secure retirement, they'll come back to government anyway to pick up the tab for it. So I know there are many people in the private sector that don't have the defined benefit pensions that public sector still has, but I don't think that's a reason to move away from that in the public sector. We need to instead talk about what are some of the new and creative strategies to come up with perhaps some new savings vehicles to help those in the private sector that don't have access to the kind of pension benefits that we have in the public sector. But having more and more people to be less secure in retirement doesn't make sense to me.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, Mary Watson, the New School. You're running a very large and complicated organization, and there are a lot of finance and business professionals who come directly in contact with you and are all around this room today. I'm part of a group that's looking at the future of business and management education around the world and really questioning what changes need to be made. And we released a report at the Rio Plus 20 meeting. So I'm curious, based on where you sit and your oversight, particularly of private firms and Wall Street, what do you think needs to change in terms of the preparation of professionals as they enter these finance and accounting and other business-oriented firms and professions? How would you advise that we look forward to actually reshape the way in which they're educated?
Well, the first thing I would say is that because I'm a graduate of the New School, Milano School of Management, that's why I was well prepared to be controller. So that was a little bit of a setup, maybe, right? Actually, I did have a good credential to be controller. I could be appointed controller, even objectively, if we go to your change. You know, there are obviously many pieces to look at with that question in terms of the changing business environment and requirements. But if I would answer that question, perhaps taking it a step back in terms of a fundamental, I think business organizations need to be grounded with a more clear sense of not only getting the good results, but how you go about getting them. And that gets back to some of what I talked about earlier with transparency and integrity. And I think so much of what's disheartening to people when they see what's happening with the banks or with many of the businesses, it's always been when there hasn't been a transparent process, when it seems that, you know, getting to the bottom line at any cost was more important than doing it the right way, or when there was a failing or a problem, to not own up to it, you know, right away. In some ways, it gets back to a sense of perhaps business ethics, you know, as much as anything else. So, and that's not unique to business. I think that's true of people involved in not-for-profit management. You know, New York Times reported on one of our audits today with special education programs. We had a series of them. You know, basically people taking advantage of the funding and ending up with a lot of money being spent on personal gain rather than money spent on the needs of the kids. So you could look at government, you could look at not-for-profit, you could look at business, and I think this whole sense of what the right values are is where we're really running into trouble across the board. So I think in terms of business and management preparation, I mean, obviously there are always trends and new strategies to keep up with, but having a more clear sense about the, you know, the issues of integrity and ethics and doing it the right way, all with an underpinning of transparency being very, very important. I think that to me would be the most important value. You know, I find even, you know, you take a piece of our operation like the pension fund. You know, I mean, some people maybe, you know, have innate skill or sense about what a good investment is, but the reality is most people, they can come and they can learn it. If you have you know, if that's your interest and you know how to do analytics and can look at balance sheets and so on, but all of that means nothing if you don't have a core sense of doing it the right way. So I would, and the reputation of an organization could be destroyed overnight, you know, because of that. So I would say starting with some of the fundamentals and having it be understood and reiterated that you know, you can't ever move away from issues of value issues, of integrity, of ethics, of transparency. That to me is something that's lacking across the board, and if business and management education could start with that as the foundation for people, I think the outcomes will be better across the board.
All right,
And I did have a great experience at the new school, so I will put another advertisement for them.
all right. Thank you very much.